wanted to give a different perspective, a little bit personal about how we've come to this point in time. You know, we've seen these pictures of the old hospital where everything started, and now to this brand new hospital that we're all very proud of, and just to reflect on how things have come to the point they are. Well, first of all, we've mentioned Keith Jones, and he's at the funeral of Bob Ravitch, who was, again, a very major influence and very experienced haematologist that brought a lot to this hospital. This was at Bob's funeral, and Keith was there, Sam Millican, myself, and David. And Keith I want to mention because he was, as David said, really a pioneer in his time in transplantation. And he wrote this article, or did this transplant in 1960. This was 2 years after the first publication of doing this type of autologous transplant. So I might explain some of the terms for our lay audience. So using a person's own bone marrow, and he reported with that 4 people that James showed, Harry Cumberland, Doug Piper and Tom Reeves, surgeons, about a lady with advanced melanoma and had initial treatment that then came back with a big mass in her abdomen. And so the surgeons went in and chopped out the melanoma, but at the same time Keith harvested bone marrow from their sternum and the iliac crest, their pelvic bone. And they even said in the paper, you know, Ken Bradstock said earlier how that was known that the spleen harboured some of the bone marrow stem cells that they could regenerate. And in the article, they were actually planning to clamp the artery, the splenic artery, and they said they were going to infuse oxygenated blood into the spleen while they gave chemotherapy to the patient. Just incredible. They were way ahead of their time. They understood so much, and because the patient had a big tumour in the spleen, they weren't able to do that. But they did this experiment, and at the time of this transplant, gave about a fifth of the dose of melphalan that we would currently use. But the patient survived, recovered, and at the time of reporting about 4 months later, was still alive and apparently well. So Keith really was a pioneer, and the first transplant, possibly in Australia, was done in 1960. Well, we're only as good as the people who work with us and our skills. And each one of us, all of my colleagues here, all of the nursing staff, we gain our skills from all around the world. And I was very fortunate because of the legacy that many people had gone to Hammersmith Hospital in London before us, gave me the opportunity. And James, again, was really an encouragement and introduced me to people at Hammersmith Hospital, which was a leader in the field of transplantation, particularly in chronic myeloid leukemia. And this is me at my farewell party at Hammersmith with John Goulburn on the right there, giving some speeches and so on. But this was really an important part for me, and as many of us have gone to international places overseas to learn from the experts, and you know, there's this saying, we stand on the shoulder of giants, and that for me was like Professor Goulburn, who taught me so much about bone marrow transplantation. So I came back to Australia in 1987, and I put up here that, again, we could only do this because of the skills, the people that existed. None of this occurred in a vacuum. And you know, we've got the big players. James was really the head of department, the one that was responsible for this idea. David, as we've seen, setting up the laboratory side was essential. Roger, we can't say enough about Roger Skur. I'm so happy you're here today, Roger. We couldn't do anything if we weren't able to harvest bone marrow. Annabella Chang, and in the centre there, Sally Bone, who was really an incredible person that was like a solid foundation of our team of nurses, and all of the allied health and laboratory staff that David's mentioned. And you can see this young guy with red hair there, an important part of our team, Dr. Luke Coyle, who's now risen to the heights of head of department, which he's really thoroughly enjoying, aren't you? But we had a lot of planning. It was actually a lot of fun time back in '87. I came back and I was full of enthusiasm. We had David and James and Luke and a lot of nursing staff, and we prepared everything. We had meetings with all of the nurses. We did education sessions. We planned everything, and David was responsible for writing up our manual for bone marrow transplantation, for autologous transplantation. And this is the index here. You can see that we thought of everything. So here we've got catheters, the nursing care, the infusion, post-graft management, nutritional care we were thinking about, bleeding management, emotional support was already in our sites, pain control and discharge planning. So we really had it all there in the initial protocols that we developed. So we were able to do this carefully and well thought out to develop our transplant program. And you can see these are the main players, the medical, Ma, Arthur and Coyle, Sister Sally Bone and Sister Stubbs, and all of the rest of the team that made up our transplant program. So David mentioned we had to start up, I had to do a business case to have an ambulatory care unit. We realised that we couldn't just have patients wandering all over the place and in the oncology clinic, so we commandeered a 4-bed ward in the hematology ward and converted it into an ambulatory care unit we called 12H, the hematology department. And we had our apheresis in there with this one machine. We put some desks in there. We had 3 or 4 beds crammed on one side of the wall, and we had a waiting room outside. So our patients in post-transplant follow-up were able to come and in our first initial ambulatory care unit with 4 or 5 patients, compared to what you see today, 50 or 60 beds. But we had to start somewhere. Sally Boner, I mentioned, was our charge nurse at the time, and she apologised that she can't be here today. And I just want to read this letter from her. She says, "What a lovely surprise to receive your call and invitation to the transplant celebrations. I'm so sorry I won't be able to attend. I will be in Hobart at a wedding. No doubt you have made contact with all of the wonderful, hard-working team, a very special time, and I feel incredibly blessed to have worked with such a dedicated, people-centred, caring, forward-thinking team." She's too kind. James, there's so much to be proud of. There are many who contributed so much, and she mentions here the name of many of the staff, particularly the nursing staff, Shelley Mune, Lynn Huskins, Sheila Scott, Kelly O'Connell, who was our first bone marrow transplant coordinator, Bernie Lee, Karen Eaton, Angela Booth, Des Perry, our social worker, Keith Piggott, and Steve, the wonderful Catholic priest from Narrabeen, and Angela, even the cleaner. So that was something about our ward, that even the cleaner, we recognised the importance. Without a clean ward, it was not possible to do this sort of procedure. Linda Nolasco, Claire Bannister, and Rosemary. I'm sure Yvonne remembered so many more, and Yvonne Gonnet is here with us, not forgetting the dedicated medical staff. I'm sorry I won't be with you in body, but will be in spirit. Enjoy the celebration so deserved by you all at Haematology at Royal North Shore. Much to be proud of. So that's the sort of person that Sally is. I haven't got a picture of her because she was always in the background, and I didn't have something that I could find in all of our pictures. Now, we started off doing autologous transplant, but we rapidly moved to do allogeneic transplants after all of that planning. And this was based around a single patient, a 16-year-old boy with advanced lymphoblastic leukemia that we were planning to refer to St Vincent's Hospital. And we looked at each other and we said, well, I'd just done 50 transplants at Hammersmith with David and James, who are very experienced. And we had this boy, we'd taken him through the journey of getting into remission with his leukemia. And we discussed it with ourselves and said, we can do this, we believed, as well as St Vincent's could do it. And we had to start somewhere. The patient wanted to stay at North Shore. The parents wanted him to stay here. And we spoke to the hospital administration. Basically, as James said, we think we should do this. They were a little bit funny about it, but we won out in the end. And we had to think, what is the best for the patient and what was his preference for the treatment centre? And we did the transplant in this young boy. He did well after the transplant, although years later his leukemia relapsed, and that was in 1988. For the next 10 years, it was fairly plain sailing. We became the largest autologous transplant centre, I think, in Australia, probably, but we restricted ourselves just to related allogeneic transplants, and so our numbers for allogeneic transplants weren't particularly big. But then in 2001, there was something pretty disastrous about to happen, and as a result of a process in the government, a new plan for transplant in the state, we were told that we had to shut down our allogeneic transplant that would be centred just at St Vincent's and at Westmead. And this all came about through a new plan for health. Lots of money was injected in by Craig Knowles, the health minister. They told us we were all going to be involved as clinicians in how services were delivered, and particularly focused on chronic and complex care, which our patients were, having treatment close to where patients lived. And so I ran with that, and we were all very excited with this thing called the Greater Metropolitan Services Implementation Group, and which promised us as clinicians that we would be able to get involved in planning services, and they would take notice of what we want. So it was really a very exciting time. But it became apparent pretty soon that we were going to focus transplants at just allogeneic transplants at just 2 centres. And that was going to be Westmead and St Vincent's. And I could talk for an hour about how this all came about, but obviously for me that was a big disappointment considering where we'd come, and we'd been doing transplants for 10 years. A lot of money came out of this for Central Coast, Central Sydney, Newcastle, St Vincent's got $2.5 million recurrently, Nepean, Westmead got over $2 million, so a lot of money was dished out. Now, North Shore got nothing, and I could have seen myself as a failure because I was head of the department at the time, but it was very disappointing, needless to say, that all of this money, and we've done all of the transplants with internal budgets, with nothing from outside, and so I was pretty depressed at this, and really spent the next 10 years depressed and anxious and tense and not having much sleep, and a thing called the BMT network was formed, and Tony Dodds was the initial chairperson, co-chair. I was then subsequently elected to this, and the next 10 years was meetings with the health department, a member of this BMT network, to try and make transplant services for New South Wales better, and many good things came out of it. We've got Richard Macon here today to talk a little bit about it. But this is, you can't read this, I can't read it either, but anyway, it's from Kerry Goulston telling us that because of this process that we were going to be stopped from doing allogeneic transplants, and it will be carried out at only 2 sites. We'll get all of the funding. And then I started writing to every man and his dog. I would write 10, 20-page documents justifying from all of the evidence why we should continue doing transplants. And this was to Craig Knowles, and I wrote to Deborah Piccone, the Director General, to everyone I could think of, to Kerry Goulston, and putting what I thought were very cogent arguments about they were wrong and we should continue doing transplants here. I got some replies, but the most important thing was that our CEO at the time, Stephen Chrisley, supported us and wrote to the Minister or to the Director General and supported us in being able to do transplants. And so even the board supported us to continue to do our allogeneic transplants. And so that made a big difference. At least our senior administration supported us in what we were doing. And he's written here, good news, Chris, because Deborah Piccone wrote back and said, well, as long as you're doing 10 transplants, we won't shut you down. No promise of any funding, but at least we had some reassurance that if we continued to do the work, we would continue to exist. Around this same time, there was an announcement that North Shore would finally get some funding. That was becoming an embarrassment to the government that North Shore had been so lacking in funding for new infrastructure compared to every other area health service, that finally we got our new hospital was announced. And we spent many years trying to develop this, and myself and my colleagues, we tried to meet with the planners, and we could never get to meet with them. So look, we want to be from the ground up. But and I often got into trouble because I'd speak out to the media and the press and so on. And I said, for example, this was in the Mossman Daily, we had a fantastic vision for a comprehensive tertiary cancer service, but some faceless planning committee thought they knew better. I was wrapped over the knuckles many times. And even here, Kevin Rudd came to visit here a few years ago, and I got up and said, of course, said the hospital is going to be a mess because they're not funding it properly. And I said something like, they're building this hospital, it's like building a Ferrari and leaving the engine out. And Channel 7 came up afterwards, and I was saying a bit of this. They said, no, say what you said about the Ferrari. And that appeared on Channel 7 News that night, and the next day I was in big trouble from Sue Selby. Anyway, I think that's, anyway, I said what I felt needed to be said, and I don't apologise. So we had to fight for the hospital, and this is some of us, the whole hospital went marched on Parliament House, and it was really a great time of unification of all of the staff here, all of the cleaning staff, the doctors, the nurses walking side by side, and all of us in our team walked on this on Parliament House. At the same time, we were trying to plan this new hospital, and we were given a generic 30-bed ward. The idea of the planners was that a haematology ward, we know how to build a haematology ward, you just put a couple of extra single rooms in. But fortunately, I put again another 20-page submission about how to build a cancer ward. And we submitted this design. Unfortunately, there was a girl called Corinne Watson working with Tees that was developing the new hospital, and she just developed the bone marrow transplant unit at Westmead. We were able to look at a lot of the work that they'd already done, and she redesigned the ward. We couldn't fit the 30 beds in, but we were able to do 21 beds, and I said, it's better to have 21 good beds with all of the state-of-the-art things that a transplant or haematology person needs than to have 30 beds, which will just be a recipe for cross-infection. But after I wrote, I gave them a document this thick of all of these standards, international standards, Australian standards, and lots of justification. But it had to go to external review, and Ian, Kerridge and David Collins were appointed. They were working at Westmead at the time to review our submission, and fortunately they said, yeah, this is a good idea, and it finally got up and we got our 21 state-of-the-art ward. But over this time it was a difficult time. We didn't know whether we would continue to exist. There were endless meetings with the health department. I went to every meeting. With, Ken Bradstock was there as well, because if we missed a meeting we thought we'd basically have our funding withdrawn, or someone else would be would get ahead of us. So it was a time of great uncertainty. And then in 2010, this final report of this 10-year work of the Transplant Specialty Services Review came out, and some administrator came to me and said, oh, look, well, I've got a letter here saying that North Shore is going to be granted $1.5 million to do transplant, enhance your transplant, including doing unrelated donor transplants. And we'd heard nothing of this, so it came as finally a justification and vindication of all the work that we'd done. Other people in the state were unhappy because that was $1.5 million they didn't get, but I didn't apologise. I thought this was the right thing for. This was what our patients needed. We were a big unit, one of the biggest units, and this is what I thought was the right thing to do. But Matt and I then had to put in a submission. This was new as well, because we had to become registered by the Australian Bone Marrow Donor Registry. Massive amount of paperwork, and we were here many late nights putting together the documentation. And then late December one afternoon, we called a taxi into the Red Cross, where the Australian Bone Marrow Donor Registry Committee were meeting, and we handed over our documents, our submission, not knowing whether we would be accepted. And about a month later we heard that, yeah, we were accepted and we could start doing unrelated donor transplants. So just to give you some background of what was required, the hospital started to go up, and here's me and Nick Pavlakis and Keith and me inspecting the wards and the unit as it was being built. And then we finally were proud to move into our new ward. This girl here in the middle of Ray Orallo and Cassandra and Yvonne and myself is Joanne Turner. And I put this up to acknowledge all of our patients, family and friends that have done fundraising for us. Joanne had acute lymphoblastic leukemia about 15 years ago and remains well. Didn't have a transplant, but the day she was having some of the chemotherapy, she was organising a fundraising concert in North Sydney. So finished the chemo, went down, and then organised and coordinated this concert that was for fundraising for the ward. And there are many others. I haven't got time to show you all, but I want to thank all of those donors and benefactors that have contributed and done a lot of hard work to raise funds for our department. And then we had this milestone a couple of years ago, 1,000 patients, and here's Alan Deans mentioned there, the Coonabarra brand farmer, the 7th patient, now 29 years or whatever since you had your transplant, Alan. It's good to really have you here today. So we're also grateful for the inspiration that our patients give us, and I want to pay tribute to, because some people are not with us today, and there are those that survive and those that, despite the best efforts, we've not been able to overcome their disease. And everyone has inspired all of us, the staff, the nurses, the doctors, with your courage and what you've done and what you've taught us about the meaning of life. This is Lavinia, who had a transplant for AML about 10 years ago, and has competed in the Transplant Olympics. And she told me they were complaining because she won too many gold medals. And then in swimming, she was a fantastic swimmer. And then she went into track and field, and that's when they really complained, because she was winning, things like javelin showing and other things. And but our patients have always been an inspiration to us, and so it's really good to have some of you here today. Our staff, I can't speak highly enough of the talented staff that we have, nurses, Ray there, and all of our allied health people. And we know how to have fun together. So James was instrumental in, I think, and Keith before him, in developing a team where we can get on with each other, where we respect each other, and we can have fun together. And it's no way to, you can't work well unless you have a good, cohesive team where we respect and care for each other. And I think from well before my time, that was already engendered by James and Keith before him. These are just some of the faces. Cleo, I'm glad that Cleo's here today, that looked after our apheresis for so many years. And it's good to see, as we get older, our registrars. Matt Wright here is head of department, I think, in Perth. John Kwan here, Anna Johnson. So it's really gratifying for us to see that those that have come through our corridors and we've been able to teach have now got into senior positions in haematology. And these are just some more of our team. You see all of our members here, and John Moore appearing again, Peter Rankin, Angela Booth. So we're blessed to have so many good people that have worked as our registrars and now gone on to bigger and better things. And finally, I just want to thank all of our support, and particularly our family. My wife can't be here today, but she, why should I get emotional? Because I begged her to come, you know, but she's got grandchildren to take here or there, and my daughter's got to go here and there. But Leonie, all of us are grateful to the support staff that have cared for us. And doing haematology is a tough job because it goes from the depths of humanity to the heights, and so we really depend a lot on those that look after us, our wives and husbands, and all of the rest of our family. Without we could do little. And Leonie is important also because she was our first transplant registry data manager. So she was instrumental in setting up the transplant registry, reporting to the international registry, which she did for many years before she knew it was time to go and look after the grandchildren. So anyway, that's just a run through of our story. Thanks.